to make things clear, we're discussing the movie, not the book. Although, obviously, I have read the book. In fact, you may or may not be surprised to learn I have read basically all the Tom Clancy novels, including the ones that weren't actually written by him, but say Tom Clancy in giant print on the front, and then actually written by this guy in tiny little print. It's a common thing that several publishing companies do. I want to talk about that really quickly. I didn't really deliberately read Tom Clancy novels. I mean no offense to people who will like them. I find them passable, but they were novels that I had to read when I had nothing else to do, and the only novels available were those. So it was basically that or sit and stare at a wall were my options. So I burned through a pretty large library of his works, and I found his style of writing interesting. It was not exactly the best stuff in the world, and he has some very unique hallmarks to him. What I find interesting is he has a bit of a thing for military precision, while at the same time having a thing for Hollywoodization. There's several things in this movie, for example, that you could probably look at and think, oh, well, they just changed that to make it more suspenseful for a movie. And there are a couple things that are presented that way. But the overall structure of the story and the events that happened actually happened that way in the book. This is a fairly faithful recreation of the novel. It misses some details, obviously, and changes a few things, like the caterpillar drive in particular was changed. But one of the things that I find interesting about Tom Clancy, let's ignore whether we like it or not. Let's talk about his writing style, because it's very relevant to this movie. He does what I call connecting points very well. He's the kind of person, I forget which book this happened in, but there's a specific book where it started off with, like every now and again, it would just cut to this log that's being chopped, this tree, and then the people will chop the log down, and things that are going wrong with the log. Tiny little details that slowly over the course of time, due to the nature of how random events can be, lead to the fact that this log ends up falling off of a cargo ship in transit, which then becomes a major proponent for a battle later happening on between submarines because of a log. Now, I actually like that. That's probably my favorite aspect of his writing, the fact that he will show how tiny, insignificant little things can completely change a series of events. And he likes to show how one individual who happens to know things differently, or that we know their motivations or whatever, can cause major changes for a wide-scale thing. The attack on the Congress building is an excellent example of that, for example. So he's pretty good at that sort of showing all the things. If I was to describe it visually, Tom Clancy novels feel like watching a puzzle being put together. Every piece has some purpose or portion or relevance to the overall picture that's being formed. And by the end, you'll see how every single piece, everything he's writing about, actually kind of lines up together. Now, by the flip side, it is a little weird how everything happens to fill together like that, but at the same time, that's kind of his style, so I'm not just debarging it. Of course, the other thing that Tom Clancy is known for very well, the thing that he's probably more known for than his whole, the thing I just mentioned, the puzzle piece thing, is his writing of military, the fact that he tends to get really big into military concepts, ideals, tech, the actual hardware. Lord knows he's done lots and lots of work outside of fiction with regards to military writing and that sort of thing. And that's on display here as well, very, very much so. This is an excellent look at the everyday function and usage of submarines. Even the director for this movie gets tons of praise. I don't even remember his name. It wasn't someone I recognized. But whoever they are, they did a lot of really good stuff. There's a ton of showing, not telling. There's a ton of visual elements everywhere and excellent scene transitions. So they don't hold your hand through it. They don't say, I mean, so many movies nowadays. Hang on, I'm getting like 3 tiers off topic. Clancy tends to focus on military work, right? So the director took that and said, well, rather than have 3 paragraphs explaining the function of this and that, why don't we just show it in the background while this is happening and astute people will notice it? So that's the director taking it. Now, to move to the third step here, one of the things that bothers me about some films, and it's not just modern films. People have this weird notion that modern movies are worse than older movies. I don't get that at all. There are sensationalized movies that are worse than older movies, but that was also true then. As I like to point out many times, the NES, despite all of its incredible games that it had, also had some real stinkers, but people tend to just remember the amazing games on the NES. I feel it's the same way with movies. I actually had a big discussion with a friend of mine several months ago where he was talking about movies were just different back in the old day. And I'm like, well, that's a duh statement. Would you like to clarify that? Because I like engaging in discussion. He was an intelligent man. So he's like, well, I feel like they had a different focus on this and that and blah, blah, blah. And basically what he was saying without actually saying it, was I feel movies were better in the older days. And then I said, all right, and I started talking with him about it. And after a while, he and I both agreed that that's because the movies that tend to stick with us are either the really good ones or the really bad ones. So he was remembering all the really amazing movies that he loved when he was growing up. He was a bit older than I am. And then he looks at all the movies that got all the publicity and all the press nowadays, which are not particularly well constructed, and therefore are worse. But at the same time, there are amazing movies that are made today, and there are terrible movies that are made back then. I actually plan to talk about this in next week's Lore Week, and by next week's Lore Week, I mean from my perspective, so about a month and a half ago from your perspective. I'm recording these way in advance. I'm trying to get this new system rolling, especially since I have a lot of very, very, very large games, like Pillars of Eternity coming up, which is going to be way more than a week to push through. Anyways, so a movie like this, I sat down, did research on it, watched the movie a second time. This is basically just going to take me one day. This is one of the shortest ruminations in terms of prep time I've ever done. I thought about rereading the book, but I actually didn't have a copy handy, and I couldn't find one easily accessible, so I said, nah. I was asked to talk about the movie anyways. Now, why am I bringing up this whole thing about the old versus the new and all that fun stuff? It's because modern, I'm saying that wrong, bad movies will not, they'll have, a question will be posed in the story and then immediately answered because the people in charge, whether it be the directors or the writers or the actual executives in charge of pushing the movie or whatever, don't have any faith in the audience having a brain. So they shove the information to you. It's like, this could be the end of everything. Why? Well, let me explain it to you in excruciating detail. There's no suspense there. There's no dread. There's no feeling of tension when you're just told, this could kill all life on the planet. What's more tense? Let me just give you a direct example, or excuse me, an indirect example. I'm making this up off the top of my head. You hearing about this colossal space station which is deorbiting, and that's all the information you have, or someone sitting down and holding your hand through the situation and saying there's a colossal space station which is deorbiting and it's got this much mass, and when it collides it's going to cause this kind of damage. We're talking about a global event. People are going to die. Millions are going to die. Now, I don't want to disparage anyone who likes the second approach, but for me, I prefer the former, because in the former case, all of that is in your head. You have to decide how horrible things are. You have to realize how dangerous this situation is. You have to understand this atrocious and disgusting thing because you build that tension because you understand what's going on. The film doesn't hold your hand. The film doesn't treat you as if you're stupid. The film puts the information there and just sits back. By the way, we're doing a slightly different method of doing the background noise. I'm sorry, I meant to talk about this first. I'd love to hear your feedback about it. You'll probably all hate it. That's usual. I'm okay with that. But I've been trying, the ambient thing. The problem is I actually went out and bought a bunch of ambient sounds to go ahead and put in the background. But so many of them don't work unless they're loud. Like, they're so quiet they just sound like just white noise. And so the only ones that worked are like the rain ones. And I don't want every single one of my ruminations to sound like rain. So I'm trying something new. There's this whole system I've got a thing going in the background right now which should be playing music. Hopefully, fingers crossed, I can't hear it. I'll hear it when I do editing later. Let me know what you think of it. We're trying to keep it very quiet so it doesn't overwhelm things. But I want something other than just total silence in the background when I'm talking. But as ever, I'm listening for your guys' feedback. So this film does that a lot. The director is very smart. In many ways, he will not hold your hand. It will just be like, here's the situation. And then they sit back and let you think, oh my God. This is very tense. It is worthy of note, this this book was written put out in 1984. The movie came out in 1990. And that's relevant because the Cold War was still happening when this book was being written, although it was pretty much on its way out the door. And when this is not a joke, when they were in production of this movie, the Cold War officially, formally, really ended. People disagree on when the Cold War ended, but the specific incident I'm referring to is the removal of the Communist Party from the Soviet Political Bureau. The Politburo, or however the heck you're actually supposed to say that, forgive me. So, they actually went out of their way to add that intro that's at the beginning of this movie and shift it around just to state this movie happens in 1984. Although actually the movie should have happened in 1982, but let's not nitpick here. So that's something to keep in mind. This is very much a Cold War movie and a product of its era no less. This movie would have fit in perfectly with all the other Cold War movies that came out in the 80s, especially ones like this, action-y. I want to talk about that action-y thing really quick. The thing that I find interesting about movies like this is there's nothing wrong at all with a high-octane action movie. Rah, psh, explosions, People give Michael Bay a lot of crap, for example. But he does have his things he's good at, and explosions are not actually the only thing he's good at. But I don't want to get into defending Michael Bay again. Lord knows I've done that enough lately. I just want to say that there's something to be said for high-octane, lots of energy, lots of action, lots of movement, lots of fluid, lots of tension kind of movie style, right? This goes for something different. There are a few scenes that are very action-y. Basically, the entire finale, right there at the end when Skarsgård's sub shows up and they have to go after the cook, who's a GRU agent, I don't think they ever say he's a GRU agent in the film. GRU, if you don't know what that means, go look it up. They don't exist anymore, I swear. Please return my cat. So all of that was definitely tiled up to more action-y, But again, that's fairly similar to how things happened in the book. Most of the film is very much a completely different type of action. Now, I say that because, in my opinion, this is still an action film. It's much more of a suspenseful action film than it is a running action film. If I could use an analogy here really quick. A running action film, a high-octane action film, is one where you're running your race, going as fast as you can, sprinting specifically, not running, not jogging, sprinting. You're going full tilt, trying to go. This kind of action film is more when you're holding your breath. Like you're about to do this really big high dive, and you're just holding your breath, and there's like 50 things that can go wrong with this jump. And so much of this action is just you tensing up and trying to make sure everything lines up correctly, and again, that holding your breath, you're just tense the entire time. I've seen this film before. I've read this book before. I was still tense rewatching this film as I was sitting here, right here, in this chair, on this monitor. I'm like, oh my god. Because it's very good at that sort of suspense. Very, very good. And part of that, of course, I am, of course, a ship guy, so that's part of it. And, of course, I understand how horrifying subs are, and how horrifying the Cold War was in general. Before I digress into those things, though, I want to talk about a couple of other things with regards to Clancy's writing style, because I want to talk a little bit more about the making of this film real quick. Jack Ryan is, of course, the main character of most of his earlier works. In more recent works, his son has basically taken over as the main character. I don't like those stuff at all, by the way. I don't care for those books. The thing I find interesting about Jack Ryan is he's probably the most positive archetype of an American that I've ever seen portrayed in fiction. And I mean that sincerely. He is clearly designed to be the idealized version of what an American person should be like. That's one of the other highlights, or common features, I should say, of Tom Clancy's writing. People tend to be fairly patriotic. Actually, on both sides, really. There's an excellent book he wrote about a defector coming over from the Soviet Union, and I don't remember the name of the book, forgive me. But when he shows things from the other perspective, the members of the Union are also very patriotic, very loyal, very stalwart. The ones who are not are the exceptions, the rare unusualities. So Jack Ryan, he is someone who is kind of an everyman. He's got a wife, Beverly Crusher, who has one scene. It's not Beverly, you know what I mean. He's got a kid, he's got a home life, and he's got his own little thing. He's a desk jockey, basically. He's an analyst. He's not really a badass. He's not really that kind of, I'm going to go and do all this stuff. And yet at the same time, they go out of the way to establish his credentials and the fact that he has, to put it into military terms, earned the uniform. That he has actually taken action, that he has actually endured this crap, that he does deserve to consider himself someone who belongs in the overall upper echelons of the U.S. government, basically. Which is funny, considering, it's spoiler alert for 20-year-old books, he actually becomes the president in one of the books. Very much by accident, but whatever. Point being, though, I'm not saying that as a negative thing. Because there's another interesting aspect of that. Again, very patriotic is Tom Clancy's style. Now, in the making of this film, they actually approached the U.S. Navy and said, help. And the U.S. Navy said, cool. Actually, originally, the way it went down was a little more complicated. Let me rewind a little bit. There's a man named Mark Neufeld. I hope I'm pronouncing his name right. He spent a year and a half lobbying to make this movie because nobody wanted to make it. And you're thinking, why? Why would it take so long? Because most people who read the script, most executives who read the script, said the script was too complicated. This isn't going to work in a film format. People are stupid. So, I'm exaggerating slightly for comedic effect. But regardless, there was a lot of opposition to this film being made until he finally sat down with a Paramount executive and got the Paramount executive to read the book. And the executive said, green light, let's do it. He got together a lot of things with regards to that. And this is when they went to the Navy. I don't want to go over all the details, but basically they went to the Navy and said, can we do this? There were some concerns of actually revealing top secret info. In fact, there was a small, controversy at the time because it was believed that they were revealing sensitive material within the movie. Whether that's true or not is going to depend on information that I don't have access to. All I will say is I heard about that even when this movie came out, thanks to the members of my family who are in the military. Within the Navy in particular. Regardless, they went to the Navy and said, can we do this? And the Navy basically was very receptive. There's actually a gentleman, I wish I'd written his name down. He is the guy who is in charge of interacting with groups, with civilian groups within the U.S. Navy. He's stationed on the West Coast. And he said, let's make this work. And this actually is a fairly common thing. Anytime you get a major military presence in the making of a movie, it tends to make the movie a lot better, but it also carries a very powerful caveat. See, here's the better part. Most of the time, this happened with Top Gun as well, actually, believe it or not. But there's several other movies, and in fact, the early Transformer stuff is another good example of this. But there are several movies where you get the military involved. You get to show off the real hardware in many cases. That's actually an APC. That's actually a submarine. That's actually a fighter, And you get to show, in many cases, people who have military service or people who are in the military doing the behind-the-scenes, run-of-the-mill stuff just as part of their day-to-day job. And you get some funding benefits from that because that makes so many shots so much cheaper. Now, in the case of this film, they actually had to film most of this on a soundstage, but they did do some actual work on submarines for this, so, that was something that working with the Navy helped tremendously. Here's the downside. This has been universally true. Whether this is acceptable or not kind of depends on your opinion. But it boils down to, if you get the actual U.S. military's help in making a movie, they get kind of a final say on the script. Now, historically, how much the military interferes with the script varies from movie to movie. In this case, very lightly, actually. Just a few slight alterations were made. But they do retain that right of final change. Some people this doesn't bother because of the fact that, they're basically investors at that point. And the investors are the people fronting the money, and they want to have final say. Some people it does bother because at that point these movies become part propaganda films. And yet it is worthy of note that part of the reason the U.S. military has historically pushed for this kind of thing is for the propaganda purposes. That's one of the benefits for them. In fact, the gentleman I mentioned earlier, the West Coast gentleman involved in this movie, on the Navy side, that was actually one of his desires. He wanted this film to help make the U.S. Navy seem better, to be a nice propaganda piece for them like Top Gun had been for the Air Force. So whether that's good or bad is going to depend on your opinion. I'm not going to lay judgment on that one. What I am going to say is what they changed. This shouldn't surprise you. The U.S. military is portrayed in a very positive light in this film. In fact, if you'll notice, there are no U.S. military bad guys at all. And in fact, the closest thing we have to your typical obstructionist guy is a general from the Army. I'm serious. It's the guy in the cabinet meeting room where they're talking to, I forget which secretary. It's where Jack, is talking to Mr. Politician guy. And the general is the only one who is actually portrayed in a negative light at all. He is your typical obstructionist person in charge. It's a very common role in fiction. But, the admiral, played by James Earl Jones, great job, by the way. He's completely with it. The politician is completely with it, despite saying, I'm a horrible person, and yet I'm willing to help you out on this. The captain he encounters on the Dallas, aside from the fact that he's following orders, he's still willing to listen. The guy on the chopper is still willing to listen. At every step of the way, another good example is as the gentleman on the aircraft carrier, I can't remember his name, the guy with the Texas accent. At every step of the way, the U.S. Navy is portrayed in a very positive light. And yet that's still not really all that dissimilar from the original script. The only thing that changes is it makes a lot of them more, or I should say less, obstructionist to the overall goals of the good guys, rather than being a little more fleshed out people. But they are still patriots, even in the original work, as is typical of Tom Clancy's work. Uh, the next thing I want to talk about in the making of this kind of has to do with the approach to politics. Most of the time, especially now, when people think politics in fiction, they think things like, well, Game of Thrones is probably the most common example, but how many of you would think of things like Final Fantasy XII or Final Fantasy Tactics, or I can't think of another good example off the top of my head. Something like that. Political boundaries and concepts and all that fun stuff. The kind of thing that a lot of people just really eat up, including me, in terms of fiction. This is a political thriller, is actually the specific term for this kind of story. But it's an atypical approach because it's not really about politics directly. It's not really about the kind of political stories of machinations of people and power and moving pieces and all that. It's a little bit more about the people on the trenches making moves and changes and doing things, and then we get to see the ripples from ground center. To use a visual analogy, most political stories are like staring, you're 100 feet up and you're staring down at a massive lake, and you're watching people drop the stones into the lake to cause these ripples, and that's all the political machinations that are happening. This person's freezing a chunk over here, this person's trying to evaporate stuff, whatever. This kind of storytelling is more like you're all the way down at the level of the water, and you see one of the people here poke their finger into the water, and you still see some of the ripples, but it's from this perspective rather than from this perspective. Make sense? And you see a little bit of that in here, like, for example, the whole situation with the way the ambassador was dealing with the politician guy. By the way, let me just say as an aside, it's really weird how many actors I recognize in this film. Like, they're all over the place. Like, every major speaking role was someone I recognize from at least something else. Anyways, so so we see that they can't, the United States Navy in an ideal situation would just walk up and say, hey, you're defecting, right? Join us. But they can't do that. They cannot allow the Soviet Union to understand that they know that there's a defection coming, or at least they suspect a defection's coming, and they can't reach out a hand openly to them, because that would risk provoking the Soviet Union. Furthermore, the Soviet Union cannot ask for help in preventing a defection, except under certain threats, which even then they wouldn't be willing to do. And in the middle are the people actually trying to defect and accept the defectors, who cannot let anyone know that they're involved in this process, because if they do, it falls apart on both sides. It's a very, very careful political web, very, very Cold War-esque, and typical of Cold War stories like that. Now, let's talk about, I mentioned the directing thing. There's a lot of things that are amazing with the directing. I already kind of told that, but there's one thing in particular that was phenomenal. The first part of the film, as we're on the Red October, they're all talking in Russian. Well, let's not quibble about details. Okay, Hollywood Russian. Okay, and there reaches a scene where he says the word Armageddon. Now they pronounce it differently, but the word Armageddon is basically the same word in both Russian and English. So the camera zooms in until he says the word Armageddon, or Armageddon, I believe is how no, I'm saying it wrong, but whatever. He says the word Armageddon, and then from that point on, they speak English. It was a great way to transition from so you understand these people are speaking Russian, and now they start speaking English, and doing it on that point was very clever. And again, basically shows to the audience, we know you're not stupid. We know you understand these people didn't just start suddenly speaking English. Now, the movie actually does cheat a little bit later on with some of the people being interact with each other that they shouldn't be able to. And yet it is worth noting that right before that, there's a great scene where the Russians and the Americans have trouble talking with each other. And fortunately, Jack Ryan actually does know Russian, as he should as an analyst. So working during the Cold War, he should know a lot of Russian and Ukrainian and all sorts of Romanian, all sorts of other languages. And so he is actually able to speak with them. And so there's a few scenes where there's Russian and then English being talked, and then everyone switches back to English. It's smart directing. I like that. It's a very nice touch. One of the other things I want to talk about, too, is there's a great scene, there's actually several great scenes, where there's severe suspense on board. This whole movie just oozes suspense and tension. But there's scenes where they're like, oh, God, this might happen, and we're trying to catch them, and if we do this, we might be caught. We don't want to be caught, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. I said I'd talk about the ship thing. It's this note right here. But they don't just have the tension. There's character building going on during those scenes. We learn more about the individuals, the XO and Captain Ramius, I always have trouble pronouncing that because I want to say Ramius, but I'm an idiot. Captain Ramius is there, and there's so much development that happens. So it's not there's no dead air, and it's an excellent touch because it ensures that you don't get bogged down with one type of scene. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing is going to depend on opinion, but I like the variety it adds because you are ensuring that you have tension building while you have character building. You have setting and story building while you have action scenes. There's lots of things where it does basically a given scene accomplishes two things within the same scene, and it's very well done. So let's talk about Jack Ryan a little bit. Actually, no. Let's rewind. Let's talk about the submarine thing. Those of you who know me, which is probably none of you, but those of you who've seen my show for a while, you know that I like ships. I'm a ship guy. It's like one of my very few things that I would actually fanboy of. I love ships. Always have since I was very, very young. Submarines are no exception, but at the same time, they kind of are. See, no pun intended. Submarines, I should clarify. Submarines are kind of like if you could picture a crisp winter landscape, completely frozen over with a blizzard going over it. Now, if you're watching a video of that, if you're seeing it from a distance or from a warm cabin or whatever, that's a beautiful sight, isn't it? And yet, the moment you are actually finding yourself out in that blizzard, that switches from beautiful to deadly extremely quickly. It is easier than you'd think to simply die in a blizzard. And for any number of reasons I'm not even going to go into right now. And it's funny because it's such a quiet death. There's no T-Rex bearing down at you, as I like to use that parallel so many times. This is a death where you would just slowly get worse and worse until it's over. That's kind of what submarines are like to me. Very, very quietly, beautifully deadly. I don't really see most other ships that way. Most other ships are a little more loud and a little more open, a little more obvious. Submarines are like a sniper battle. You've got two snipers in a great foliage. Both of them have great camo. Both of them know what they're doing. Both of them are trying to find the other person while trying not to be found themselves. Both of them have so many things they can do to find the other person, but in so doing, be found themselves. There are so many different things that are tense and terrifying and horrifying about that concept. It is indeed one of the things that makes a truly great submarine movie. It's funny because there have only been a couple handfuls of submarine movies over the years, and most of them go for a slightly more actiony take. But this really, I think, captures better than most, not all, most submarine films, that suspense, that tension, that we have to quietly move there. And it's funny because with a couple of sections, there's no actual battles happening. There's the one battle towards the end with the American sub, the Dallas. The Red October, and I forget the name of it, but it's the other Russian sub, the one after Captain Skarsgård. And then that's the only real battle they actually have. There's a couple of other close calls, but that's the point. A sniper battle does not involve a lot of shots being fired. It involves a lot of tension, a lot of maneuvering, a lot of posturing. Remember, they basically have to cross the Atlantic in order to get over here. And that's the tension. That's the battle. They're fighting not being seen. And of course, there's the GRU operative who's disrupting everything on board. It's actually funny because if he wasn't there, there's a pretty good chance they would have just made it. And this would have been fine. But with the Caterpillar drive turned off, they suddenly have so much possibility of being discovered by everyone, and indeed are nearly discovered and shot upon. There's so many different terrifying moments of just trying to slowly, quietly sneak your way across a terrain. If I can use a parallel, I recently just played Mankind Divided from my real-life perspective. A great game, by the way. Highly recommend it. I did a premiere run of it. There's so many scenes there where it was just so tense as I'm like, okay, I just need to go here. And then there's moments where you're literally just, you're holding your breath. Because the whole point is not to be seen. If you engage in combat, you've already failed to some extent, and then you have to try and recover from that failure. The idea is not to be seen at all, and you might not recover from combat. And unlike in Mankind Divided, the people on the Red October don't have a load state thing that they can do. So, any time they get in combat, that might be the end. That might be it. One torpedo hits just the wrong way, it's over. So it's very, very tense and very, very terrifying. And it's one of the things I like about this film. Jack Ryan. So let's talk about Jack Ryan. First of all, he's kind of a dick. In many ways, in several cases, he's introduced as someone who's kind of a know-it-all. Now, that makes a degree of sense. In the same way that doctors tend to be arrogant pricks, no offense to doctors out there, but I've known many doctors in my life, and a lot of them tend to be arrogant pricks. But as my mom, who's a pharmacist, tends to say, they tend to be arrogant because it's part of their job. They need to be arrogant to have the confidence to do what they need to do when they're in the moment, when they're actually in their job, in their moment, doing the surgery or operating on or whatever it is they're actually doing. They need to just be like bam, 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 no hesitation, no question, no shaking, no whatever. And that makes sense. The problem is that bleeds off into their everyday life. It's the same thing with Jack Ryan. He is a bit of a dick, and he is very much a know-it-all. But again, he is someone who is an analyst, a CIA analyst, ex-Marine, who happens to be working on the Soviet Union in particular, has actually done missions to the Soviet Union. So, and by missions I mean diplomatic missions, not, missions. So this is someone who needs to be a know-it-all, someone who needs to have a huge grab bag of information about everything and willing to disperse it at all times. And that makes sense to me. Still made me want to punch him a few times at the beginning of the film, but, He is, however, wonderfully in over his head. Again, the movie, I keep wanting to say game, because I'm so used to talking about games. The movie does several things about trying to demonstrate how he does have credentials, as I've discussed to you already. And yet at the same time, the movie goes out of its way many times to show how he is completely in over his head. He is not capable of doing this at the level he is being asked to. He, of course, stands up and rises to the challenge, which is a fairly typical hero trope in general, and again, fits the American idealized thing I already mentioned earlier. I imagine, to be perfectly blunt, a lot of us would like to think that despite being fairly ordinary people, if we were called to the call like that, if the call happened and we had to rise up and be a hero, we would do so. Whether we would or not is a much more different question, but I think we'd like to think we would. I also like the line by the general. I mentioned he was your typical obstructionist guy. What I mean, he was so over the top, it almost made up for the lack of other obstructionist leadership types. Because he literally says to a CIA analyst who just briefed them on this matter, "You're just an analyst. What do you know?" Mr. General, do you know what an analyst's job is? No, okay, I didn't think so. I do also like, and again, this goes back to that idealized American call to the hero thing, how he basically, he put his arm in the socket, I don't want to use a cruder metaphor, but basically he was, he put his head on the chopping block. He was like, I'm willing to do this. I'm willing to put my life and my career on the line for this one, because I think I'm right. Again, there's that confidence involved, but also the fact that he cares enough to bother, and I like that. There's a great scene later where he's basically piecing things together as he slowly wakes up that I like for three reasons, actually. First reason, it makes sense movie-wise that he shouldn't figure things out that quickly, otherwise we won't have the suspense of him trying to get to the Dallas. Second reason, was it the Dallas? Actually, maybe it wasn't Dallas. Well, whatever, the American submarine. Second reason I like it, it makes sense in character. He hasn't slept in like 3 days at that point. Now I don't care how good you are. After a while going without sleep, your brain just stops working properly. That's the nature of it. Your brain basically starts shutting down functions of it in order to keep going. So it makes sense that once his brain started recovering a bit, he'd be like, well, wait a minute, and start thinking about it again and figure it out. The third reason I like it is because it's good directing, because he wouldn't just snap his fingers and do it. It's done over the course of a montage. Lord knows the 80s and 90s love their montages. But it makes sense that idea would slowly build as he's showering and getting himself shaved and getting himself cleaned up after his nap. So I like that. Let's shift to the Russian sub for a second, the Red October. So we've got the political officer. Now he is a very interesting case because he's murdered by Ramius. And yet Ramius goes out of his way to apologize to him for that, which is very interesting. And then, of course, there's the fact that you figure a political... Okay, first of all, this is a commentary, and in many ways, on the way the Soviet Union worked at the time. That a military sub had to have a political officer on board. That he had to have someone whose job it was to make sure everyone was following the party line. That's basically some dystopian stuff right there. It is probably hard to remember that was actually real life for more than one country during this period in history. So it's a wonderful insight just right there that he's there. But then the fact that he at first, like his first few lines is just, a typical party man. But then he shows just a little bit of shadings of being a person underneath that. And there's a line he says, defensively, I have to do my job. I have to follow my duty. I'm sorry, but... And then he starts talking exuberantly and whatnot, and he comes across as much more of a real person than just a guy in a suit. And I like that fleshing out. It is unfortunate because it makes Ramius' decision even more horrible to have to kill him, and that's one of the reasons I think he regretted it. Furthermore, they immediately complicate Ramius. He is a fascinating character. I kind of wanted to talk about him last, so I think I will. Let's leave him alone. I got one other guy to talk about, and then I'm kind of done. Let's talk about Jones. Jones is the sonar officer on the Dallas. Brilliant guy. But he is, once again, something Clancy does very normally, and something that fits very well in a movie of this nature. He's the guy in the trenches. Now, obviously, that analogy doesn't fit perfectly, but he is basically a low-level guy. You know, just a working military man. Not an officer, not a commander, not a general, not an admiral, not a politician. He is way down on the chart. And yet he is someone who is not only a viewpoint character for a lot of the film, but he is someone who adds significance to the film. He's the one who helps him to track the Red October. He's the one who actually helps him to find out that's a Russian sub attacking us. He is crucial in many ways to the story. He fits several puzzle pieces in Clancy's style of writing. And again, I like that everyman approach to it. It's not quite Miles O'Brien, and the film doesn't flesh him out as much as I would have liked, but it's a good perspective to have, and I like that. Especially since he tends to get so exuberant and so human, he tends to put it bluntly, forget his place several times. But I like that, because that just helps emphasize that he's a person, not an officer. He is very much not officer material, and that's a good perspective to have there. Now I'll talk about Ramius. So Ramius immediately is portrayed as a complicated individual, someone who, let me just go ahead and say, Sean Connery playing this makes perfect sense. Funny fact, Sean Connery actually didn't want to play this at first because he thought the idea of the Soviet Union being a naval superpower was ridiculous. He had actually received an incorrect copy of the script and didn't find out that it was supposed to be set several years in the past. When the Soviet Union was a naval superpower, and he's like, "Oh, okay, I'm okay with it then." It's interesting he would care about that. He, in character, Ramius knows how to play your stereotypical Soviet officer. In many ways, he challenges his crewmen as if he is, a party man, towing the line, loyal to the Mother Russia, and all that fun stuff. And yet, at the same time, he doesn't display a lot of warmth or compassion to his crew. He's not a Picard kind of leader. He's not a Kirk kind of leader. He's not a Sisko kind of leader. He's actually a Jellicoe kind of leader. I hope some of you get that reference. I'm not going to go into it. It would take too long. But some of you who understand what I mean, it's from TNG. He's more of a Jellicoe type leader because he does know his stuff. He is smart, and he is very skilled at what he's doing. In his case, that would be submarine warfare. And yet, he doesn't really bother to try to engineer trust or warmth or compassion or understanding or anything amongst his crew. He lets his results speak for themselves and insists that his results allow people to then follow him. And indeed, people do have a tremendous amount of loyalty to him. Even the people who question him still follow his orders. They just do so hesitantly because they don't understand. And then his results speak for themselves, and they understand why he did that. So that's the kind of leadership style he has. It's very interesting and very, very, very Russian, which is funny because Ramius is not Russian. He's also portrayed in many ways as a madman because we only see him for certain types of scenes. And then we see more of him. He only really humanizes himself twice in like the whole, well, excuse me, three times in the whole film. Once when he's talking with his exo, forgive me for not knowing his name, it's the main character from Jurassic Park, where he talks about that. And there's a great deal of humanity and character building in that scene. It's probably one of my favorite scenes in the whole film, where he's sitting there talking about how, we've been fighting a naval war for years with no battles, just deaths. It's a very quiet, horrifying speech, and it encapsulates almost everything that was so wrong about the Cold War. The constant state of fear and the constant lack of anything of significance or purpose or actual accomplishment. It's just a non-stop holding action where at any moment things can just go horribly, horribly wrong. And he gives this wonderful speech about that. Later on, he talks to Jack Ryan as he's talking about his books. That's his second moment. And the third moment is the end, where he's on the boat going up the river. And they're talking about fishing, and that's the third moment where he humanizes himself. It's some great stuff. It's some really great stuff. And it really helps flesh out how this is someone who as much as he is, let's make this clear, he is an officer in every sense of the word. He's probably the most officer character in this entire work. And he has a great deal of pride and a great deal of understanding and a great deal of command authority behind him. But there is a weary and frankly broken old man underneath that. I have no doubt that pretty much as soon as he came back from sea and found out that his wife was dead, that was not the thing that made him decide to defect. That was the final thing that made him decide to defect. That he would, and then he spent the next year putting this all together so he could finally get the hell out of Dodge and try to have a life that doesn't involve fear anymore. And there's this wonderful bits of lines about how, I could just travel around. No papers? Yeah, no papers. That sounds wonderful. Idealizing, of course, the way things worked in America in the 80s and 90s, but understandably so. The grass is always greener and all that. But even ignoring that, some people will just simply be more tolerant of problem A than of problem B. America, especially in the 80s and 90s, had lots of problems. But at the same time, those problems are probably much more tolerable to someone who's been dealing with the problems of the Soviet Union prior to that point in time. I am, of course, generalizing, but that is definitely the perspective we are given on both Ramius and the XO. Unfortunately, I have nothing else to say. This is a great movie. It was a real treat to rewatch it. Twice. I didn't really have to rewatch it the second time, but I kind of wanted to. I hope you've enjoyed my thoughts on it. Originally, this Rumination wasn't actually come out, but I mean, Hunt for Red October, coming out in October. Come on. I hope you've enjoyed. I hope Shadow isn't horribly disappointed in me for my terrible rumination. We'll see you next time, guys.